everyone. I hope you are doing well. Welcome to the recording that focuses on the Darling Hammond and colleagues article that you all read this week. Before I jump in, I just want to kind of illustrate or to express to all of you that this was a really valuable article, which is why we assigned it with a lot of great points, which we're going to get into in just a second. It was also a really long one. So I want to reassure all of you that the overwhelming majority of the readings that we consume this semester will not be anywhere near that length. But we decided to assign this one for a number of reasons, including its strong emphasis on applying development, obviously, to education and education practice, which is really central to the objectives and the scope of this course. And also because we thought that it gave a really nice and still kind of accessible overview of a lot of different ideas and concepts that you all will be exposed to this semester. So without any further ado, let me dive right in. But I did want to kind of address that I know this was a really long reading. As usual, you're not expected to understand even anywhere close to every word. And thanks for sticking with this one, because I know that it was probably challenging to get through due to the length and maybe some other reasons as well. Challenging, but I hope worth it, which I think it was. Okay, so let me dive into the summary. Obviously, given the length of this article, this isn't going to be anywhere near a comprehensive summary, but my goal in providing some summary points in general, and particularly this week, is to provide kind of a roadmap of the article. And as I said last week, some scaffolding related to especially when there's an article this long and you know that you can't read and understand, and certainly remember every single word. Where do you start and what kind of key points should you be looking for, or should you be trying to take away? So with that in mind, a few or at least a couple of initial things that I want to bring your attention to is, first of all, the author's overarching objective. Always try to look for an overarching objective statement, because that will really ground your understanding, along with the theoretical framework that they propose and then pursue for the remainder of the article. So in terms of the overarching objective, the authors aimed to contribute to the process of translating recent advances in research related to both human development and learning to implications for school and classroom practices. And to do so, they use a variety of different syntheses of the research as sort of a foundation for pursuing this overarching objective. So again, just to sort of repeat and emphasize that further, the authors were interested in contributing to translating recent work that's been conducted in human development and learning, and specifically applying it to schools and education practice. And something that's kind of interesting about this article is it's obviously relatively recent, being published in 2020. That's in pretty stark contrast to one of the articles that we read last week, specifically authored by Daniels and Schumau, which was published back in 2003. So this article in some ways kind of serves as a bit of an update for you all, even though the scope and the focus was a little bit different, on sort of what's happened in the last 20 plus years in terms of recent advances on human development. So that's the overarching objective. Taking all of this initial and more recent work on human development and really focusing on a comprehensive application of it to education practice. In terms of the theoretical framework, this is really important because, as theoretical frameworks kind of always do, but particularly in this case, it guides the remaining parts of the article. And they talk about how they adopt what they refer to as a relational developmental systems framework. A relational developmental systems framework. And what they mean by that is to pursue the synthesis that they report on in this article, they look at mutual influential relations between individuals and contexts. So this is another kind of area of similarity between the conversations that we've had so far, the articles that we've read, the podcasts that you've listened to, and that the authors really take an approach and adopt a framework that explores the dynamic and very sort of inextricable developmental associations between uh, context and individual and internal development. A couple things to highlight about this theoretical framework and sort of some ideas subsumed within it is that the brain is malleable. And growth occurs across the entire developmental continuum. This is another feature of the framework that we've talked about in this class in terms of the perspective that we take regarding a lifespan developmental perspective, that growth does not stop when formal schooling stops. Growth and development occur from the moment that we're born until the very end of our lives. And they also highlight within their theoretical framework a central implication for educators, specifically that all aspects of the environment support all of the dimensions of children's development, which means that a deeply integrated approach is really essential for supporting the whole child. And that, as you will be able to see in just a second when I show the figure that highlights their theoretical and conceptual framework, that's illustrated and really central to their article. So what you'll be able to see here from this excellent figure that is provided on one of the earlier pages within the article is that for the remaining parts of the article, they present this framework, which again, they refer to as a relational developmental systems framework. And they really unpack the framework based on the four major systems that they label and they discuss related to contributing to the whole child, and specifically how development and learning research can be applied to education and education practice specifically. So there are four major areas that structure the remainder of the article. First is a supportive environment. Second is productive instructional strategies. Third relates to the social and emotional learning piece. And fourth are the systems of support that enable healthy development. As you can see here from this figure, those are the four major systems that really sort of guide the author's analysis and how they apply this research to education practice. So let's dive in. I'm going to try to be really brief here, but also to provide enough details that it kind of supports and supplements and adds to your understanding of the article. They begin every section, including this first section related to supportive environmental conditions, by summarizing the science of learning and development. That's what I mean by the L&D here on this slide. So what does the science of learning and development tell us about what's needed to foster supportive environmental conditions? A couple of points to highlight from this is they talk about work that clearly supports the idea that warm, supportive teacher-student relationships are linked to a host of key academic and affective outcomes. And there's both biological and affective significance that accompanies this sort of major conclusion within the research. Although I don't love this language, to quote the authors also talk about how students who are deemed, quote, at risk, that's the language that I don't love, tend to be more harmed by negative teacher affect and tend to benefit more from positive relationships with teachers and with others within their schools or academic settings. So those are just a couple of kind of key trends that they mentioned in terms of the science of learning and development. What that means for principles of practice is the following. They talk about how schools need to be structured in ways that support strong attachments and positive relationships. And then they identify a whole bunch of different factors that are examples of school structures that are set up to really support both strong attachments and positive relationships. They identify and synthesize research based on school size, based on a bunch of different strategies to personalize structures like block scheduling, advisory systems, interdisciplinary teaming, looping, reducing class sizes, and longer grade spans. So, for example, rather than, according to the research that they synthesize, rather than having just kind of a standalone middle school with grades 6 through 8, these authors would probably advocate for a K through 8, for example, school, so that students don't have to confront as many transitions, and which they kind of argue um, supports these strong attachments from uh, to develop. They also talk about how school and classroom communities that offer safe, personalized settings for learning contribute to supportive environmental conditions. They talk about within that classroom design and management plays a really important role in making students feel safe and non-anonymous. Unanonymous? I think I don't know. I'm not anonymous. There we go. Within the environment. And they talk about how particularly classroom design and management that is done in collaboration with students rather than to students tends to be really effective in fostering these supportive environmental conditions. And then finally, in this section, they talk about practices that strengthen relational trust and family engagement. And I think they do a really nice job in discussing some barriers that are often in place for this kind of family engagement to happen, and just really emphasize the importance of teacher relationships, not only directly with the students, but with their families whenever possible. So that's sort of the first major system within their model that they talk about as being really crucial for promoting optimal developmental outcomes. Moving on to the second major system within their framework, they refer to this and discuss this in terms of productive instructional strategies. And based on the science of learning and development, a few kind of key tenets or key trends within that literature is that, first of all, that children are natural learners. And importantly, for development, there's no single ideal developmental pathway. So there are a number of different pathways and trajectories that students can follow that lead to optimal outcomes. So that's another kind of really important tenet that they draw from to inform their recommendations for productive instructional strategies. So an important bottom line here of this of the literature that sort of grounds this section is that psychological processes like perceptions, motivational beliefs, emotions, and self regulation all really matter for learning, which is something that we are going to be returning to again and again and again in this class, and how those psychological processes develop and how their influences change over time as students grow and mature. So based on those and other, of course, major trends within the literature, they then talk again about their principles for practice that emerge based on what productive instructional strategies should look like. First, they talk about how teaching should build on and expand upon children's prior knowledge. This means that, according to the authors, teaching in general, of course, is really important. And scaffolding in particular, providing students with assistance from a more skilled adult or a more skilled peer is really important for practice. They also recommend, given the importance of prior knowledge, they recommend that teachers draw from students' prior experiences whenever possible, including drawing from their prior experiences to address not only their knowledge, their accurate knowledge, but also their misconceptions. They talk about the importance of creating rich, collaborative environments for learning in order to build on and expand upon children's prior knowledge. They talk about the need to provide cognitive supports, um, and including providing cognitive supports in a way that reduces what's referred to as cognitive load. So the amount that students have to juggle within their working memory at a single point in time is another example of the kind of cognitive supports that they talk about. Another principle that's talked about in this section that sort of emerges from the science of learning development and has implications directly for productive instructional strategies is that teaching should support conceptual understanding, engagement, and motivation. Motivation is a really important trend that's sort of infiltrated, you'll notice, throughout this article. What this means is that teachers should be aiming to um, have students be able to not just sort of reiterate or regurgitate knowledge, but to organize it and to represent that knowledge conceptually. They also talk about how inquiry-based curriculum that appropriately integrates explicit instruction is really helpful for fostering students, not only their engagement and their motivation, but also that first piece, their conceptual understanding. Another final principle for practice that they talk about within this section is developing what they refer to as metacognition, agency, and the capacity for strategic thinking. Metacognition is one of those psychological processes, particularly sort of subsumed within the ed psych world, that is talked about a lot and very rarely defined. Something I appreciated about this article is they explicitly, although briefly, but they explicitly define metacognition as simply thinking about one's own thinking. And just as kind of a quick aside to give you a little bit more background, metacognition is a really important psychological process that's sort of subsumed within the idea or the broader set of processes often referred to as self-regulated learning. So they talk about sort of in order to promote this final principle for practice, they identify and discuss three major pathways that teachers can use to develop students' metacognitive skills. One is explicit teaching about metacognition and strategic learning. So, for example, modeling to students, encouraging them to think more about the self-regulate or think more out loud, along with actually self-regulating their own motivation. The second pathway that they talk about to actually teach not only the content, but metacognition to their students is to provide feedback, but importantly, not just any feedback. Feedback that's followed by practice and revision, and feedback that focuses specifically on features of the task and emphasizes learning goals, in addition to guidance on how to improve. And this is something I'm going to return to briefly later in the recording, feedback that offers immediate opportunities to actually apply that feedback. So not just any feedback will help with metacognition, but feedback with those very specific characteristics that I just highlighted. The third pathway that they talk about is employing mastery assessment that allows students to continue making progress towards learning. So in other words, to give students opportunities for assessment and other assignments that not only just test their knowledge, but actually allow them to engage in the self-reflective, or in other words, that metacognitive process by allowing them to self-assess their own progress and to continue to make progress towards learning. They also have a brief section within this kind of major section on instructional strategies that focuses specifically on motivation and learning. And a couple of things that I'll say about this section, I think that as somebody who studies motivation, they did a really nice job for the purposes of this article, synthesizing some key practical takeaways from a very large and complex literature. a few things that they talk about is that, and I love their framing of this, actually. It really made me think as a motivation researcher, and somebody who really tries to promote motivation in my teaching as well. They mentioned, first of all, that motivation is fostered by three major considerations. First of all, what's the task? Second of all, what's the learner and their experience? And third of all, and importantly, what's the learning environment like in terms of the motivational climate that it's sort of fostering? So I thought that the way that they kind of identified those three major considerations of what actually contributes to motivation was really thoughtful. A few factors that they talk about that shape motivation is, again, to go back to that task piece, tasks that are perceived as relevant, important, and focused on problems that are interesting and realistic. They also talk about how students' beliefs about their ability are really crucial, which is shaped in part by their implicit beliefs about the nature of intelligence, which often in the literature, not actually always in this article, but often in the literature are referred to as mindsets. And then finally, they talk about sense of academic identity being really important. So, in other words, to what extent does a student self-identify with, let's say, being a math person or being a good student or being someone who is really sort of attached in terms of their identity to language arts? Just to give kind of a few examples of that sense of academic identity being really important. And importantly, to be redundant, I guess, important and importantly, they talk about how dynamically related that sense of academic identity is to school practices like applying certain labels to students, which are often done implicitly or explicitly, and tracking students. For example, tracking them into different levels of math are going to have a really important and powerful set of implications for what their academic identity looks like, especially sort of within those tracking models. Okay, their third major system that they identify is support for the development of social, emotional, and cognitive skills, along with habits and mindsets. So notice here that, again, as the middle of the figure implies, they're really trying to synthesize development and learning research as it relates to the whole child, especially given how crucial all of these psychological processes are for um, the developmental outcomes that they talk about at the beginning of the article that are that we're kind of attempting to optimize. So, what the science of learning and development tell us here is that cognitive skills interact with emotional skills and social skills to promote learning. So, similar to last week, there's that inextricable connection between cognitive skills and then um, also these kind of social emotional skills. So that's just sort of one major trend. They talk more, of course, and they highlight more evidence, but one major trend that I wanted to highlight from this science of learning and development section. And then from that, again identify some key principles for practice. And one of those principles is that schools and classrooms should explicitly teach and provide regular opportunities to integrate social, emotional, and cognitive skills. Again, at the risk of being redundant, this is very similar and related to ideas that were touted by Mary Emmerdino Yang in last week's podcast, specifically that learning is such a social and emotional process. So again, that first principle for practice is what comes out of or what emerges in terms of an implication for the fact that cognition is so intimately tied to social and emotional experiences, is that schools and classrooms shouldn't only be teaching learning or cognitive skills. They should also be teaching social and emotional skills and providing regular opportunities to incorporate them. Another principle for practice that they talk about is that students should receive guidance, explicit guidance, and implicit guidance to develop habits and mindsets that lead to optimal outcomes like perseverance and resilience, among others. So they talk about, and again, I appreciate that they explicitly define executive functions. And they talk about how executive functions operate in 4 interrelated executive domains. Attentional control is 1, cognitive flexibility is 2, goal setting is 3, and information processing is 4. And again, those 4 major domains are what make up executive functions, or in other words, major higher order thinking. They talk about how explicit executive functioning training is actually typically targeted at younger students. However, interestingly, brain changes that happen in adolescence allow students to be able to think much more abstractly and become much more deeply reflective. So they talk about how important executive functioning is and how more explicit executive functioning training might actually end up benefiting adolescents more than younger kids, or at least just as much, given these brain changes that they're experiencing at the same time. They also, within this subsection or within this broader principle for practice, that students should be receiving guidance to actually develop executive functioning habits and mindsets that end up leading to these optimal outcomes. They then talk about 4 key mindsets. And something that I want to note is when we talk about mindsets in educational psychology, we're often referring to students' beliefs about the nature of intelligence. Here, the authors are referring to something a little bit broader and different than just sort of what I described. So specifically, they talk about 4 key mindsets that we as educators need to be trying to promote in our students. One, that that students believe that they belong in school. Second, that they believe in the value of the work. Third, that they believe that effort is going to increase their abilities, or in other words, their competence. And then fourth, that students have a strong sense of efficacy and perceived ability to succeed. And again, interestingly, with regard to how these beliefs and these mindsets might operate from kind of a developmental perspective, the authors make the point that adolescents usually especially benefit from teacher, sometimes even implicit messages, rather than explicit instruction when it comes to these mindsets, rather than younger kids who tend to, or who seem to benefit more from explicit instruction of these mindsets. So as somebody who's really interested in adolescence, that's something that really, I think, is a really kind of interesting remark that they made about how we need to be really nuanced, developmentally nuanced with these principles for practice. And then they also talk about habits and mindsets in the context of reducing the effects of stress and trauma. The final principle for practice that the authors discuss sort of within this 3rd section is that schools should offer educative and restorative behavior supports that teach skills, which ultimately should lead to more, quote, positive behaviors. So in this section, they talk about how important a developmentally appropriate, and I would add asset-based approaches um, to behavior support when behavior is not the way that it should be. And specifically, they talk about how a developmentally appropriate approach to behavior management, what that looks like is that it recognizes students' behaviors rather than recognizing them as misbehaviors. It recognizes them as demonstrations of a developmental need. It's a really, really interesting reframe. And I think an important reframe as well. Um, and they talk about the fact that school discipline policies that don't see behavior or misbehavior as a developmental need, not only do discipline policies like exclusion or expulsion, not only do they often end up operating inequitably, but they also don't work all that well. And then the final system that they talk about within their model that, again, they propose based on the science of learning and development, lead to optimizing key developmental outcomes is a system of supports. And they say that with regard to the science of learning and development, what it tells us is they really emphasize adversity and trauma in this section. And they say that they make the very important point that, again, in my own reading, often goes under acknowledged, that adversity and trauma occur in all communities, as does healthy development. And in the context of adverse childhood experiences, excessive stress can undermine brain development and learning. But on the flip side, strong relationships and supports can help to buffer the negative effects of this stress. So, from those kind of major trends within the literature, in terms of principles for practice, what emerges from that is that first, schools should develop a collaborative, multi-tiered system of supports. And they emphasize the need for a shared developmental framework among all kind of advocates and socializers within the school system. They also describe a model that includes 3 tiers of support. And in implementing these 3 tiers of support, they talk about how important it is to minimize removal from the mainstream environment whenever possible in order to enact these tiers of support. Another principle for practice that the authors talk about in this section is that schools need to develop internal student support structures that actually link schools to a range of academic, health, and social services. They also talk about a principle for practice that extends learning opportunities that support personalized instruction and mentoring for all students that are needing these extra systems of supports. And they talk about, this was again just so interesting and important in general, and particularly so perhaps from a developmental perspective. But given the plasticity of the brain and its dependence on experience, the amount and the consistency of cognitive stimulation really matters. So when students are receiving less of that, that's going to undermine learning. And the point and the trend from the research that I thought was particularly sort of important from a learning and development perspective is by the end of high school. So by the time that all of these experiences have kind of culminated, as much of 2/3 of the difference in distinctions of achievement between students who are from higher and more privileged socioeconomic backgrounds compared to students from a lower socioeconomic background, 2/3 of the difference in achievement is explained by summer learning loss, which really, again, speaks to the need to provide extended learning opportunities in order, again, related to that principle for practice, in order to continue supporting that personalized instruction and mentoring that some students need. And then finally, oh, sorry, I was behind a slide. But finally, the authors then provide a conclusion for their article. And I do want to highlight a couple features of the conclusion, actually just one. And it's in the conclusion where they start talking about major challenges to implementation. And specifically, they highlight that challenges to implementation can include that a lot of the practices that they recommend depend upon policies at the state or the federal level, or perhaps more localized policies. But policies can either foster or, as is the case happening perhaps in many states right now, can perhaps thwart pretty strongly the ability to implement a lot of these recommendations. They also talk about very briefly, or they at least name limitations based on what curriculum is available, limitations based on the breadth of knowledge that teachers need in order to implement these practices, which kind of relates to what we talked about last week in the Daniels and Schumacher article. They talk about the limitations of current assessments for implementing a lot of these practices. And then importantly, also related to our conversation last week, the lack of support for teachers and admin, they label as a final challenge or barrier to implementation. So
that was sort of a marathon summary. I tried to be succinct, but I know that there's just a lot in that article. So I hope that having this figure and seeing how they sort of unpack their framework helped make sense of some of the key points in a long article that's filled with so much rich information. A few things that I want to briefly highlight from first a substantive perspective is I'm not sure if any of you were kind of wondering about this, but there was a lot less explicit developmental emphasis than I think has been the case so far in the reading that you've done and the podcast that you've listened to. The developmental emphasis is there, but it's much more implicit. Something that I wanted to flag, because this is a developmental course and it's I want to kind of use opportunities whenever I can to illustrate major developmental research and principles to all of you, is that there were some just one example of their more implicit developmental emphasis is that there were a lot of Vygotskian and Piagetian ideas sort of embedded within and throughout the article. And one pretty strong example is on page 111, if you want to take a look back at that, where from a Vygotskian perspective, they identify the ZPD, or in other words, the zone of proximal development, and the crucial role of scaffolding within that ZPD. And that's a very Vygotskian idea, and idea that has really persisted in its impact into recent and kind of current education practice. So the ZPD, it represents the space, the learning space between what a child can comfortably do on their own compared to what they can do with the support of somebody more skilled, like a teacher or a peer. And it's scaffolding that uh, really sort of targets that zone of proximal development within the child or within the learner. So again, that's a very influential and very meaningful Vygotskian idea, which again is grounded in a lot of not only developmental theory, but empirical research. So I wanted to highlight that. Another thing that they talk about around the same section of the article is the importance of experiencing what's referred to as disequilibrium. So in other words, this might not be the perfect definition of what disequilibrium means according to a more Piagetian perspective, but experiencing disequilibrium essentially happens when your new knowledge no longer fits within your existing knowledge schema, which then triggers the need to explore. And so I wanted to kind of flag that as a point that they made in the article that's grounded within a really important and meaningful set of Piagetian concepts. Okay, another thing that I want to highlight quickly is that this idea that emerged from the article that trust and positive, strong relationships are extremely not only important, but foundational for any learning that happens. And that is closely related to not only what we read last week, but some really meaningful conversations that we had last week. So really, this article, I think, continues to highlight the foundational nature of trust and relationships. They also, this article also continues to reinforce a crucial and central idea within this class, which is that individual development and content are deeply interrelated. Sorry, this says content here on the slide. What I meant was context. So individual development and context are deeply interrelated. So this is something that was emphasized to a large extent by Daniels and Schumau, but perhaps especially by Imardino Yang in the podcast last week. Another important and pretty central, even if implicit, theme of this article that I really want to highlight and encourage you to think more about is that the current education system that's in place right now was designed not only a really long time ago, but it was designed without these kind of key developmental principles in mind. So that's something that helps us make a lot more sense, I think, of the current education system when we're reminded that not only was the system put into place a really long time ago, but developmental principles were not sort of a central consideration when this system was being designed, and perhaps they weren't even in mind at all. Another thing that I want to mention from a substantive perspective that I really appreciated about this article is I really appreciated the inclusion, particularly in that first section that talked about environmental supports, the inclusion of a discussion of policy and or structural recommendations for education to foster these positive developmental outcomes. And the reason why I wanted to particularly flag it is because from educational psychology discourse and writing, those policy and structural recommendations are often, certainly not always, not necessarily part of the writing or the conversation. That being said, if you are interested in sort of learning more about the intersection between educational psychology and education policy, I definitely recommend that you check out the new special issue of a journal called Educational Psychologist that has an entire special issue devoted to this topic, specifically the application of policy to educational psychology. Another thing I want to highlight is some very powerful examples of asset versus deficit-based language within this article. So, for example, when the authors talked about, they actually quoted another scholar by the name of Gay, when they were talking about culturally relevant pedagogy and specifically funds of knowledge. Gay said and then they quoted in the articles that culturally responsive approaches to teaching teaches to and through the strengths of these students. And this is exactly sort of what we were talking about last week when we introduced the ideas of an asset-based approach to research, and particularly in this case, an asset-based approach to educating students, really centering and anchoring education in the strengths of students and other populations rather than in what might be perceived as what these populations are lacking or deficits. That, on the flip side, reflects much more of a deficit-based perspective. In terms of literature cited, of course, there is way too much to flag here, but a few concepts and constructs and literatures that I wanted to flag because I think that they were particularly well introduced and synthesized within this article. If any of you are interested in continuing to learn more about this literature, is important insights related to cognitive load theory, this idea of stereotype threat, and also the power and the pervasiveness of feedback. So those were kind of three literatures among many, many others that the authors drew from that I thought were particularly valuable starting points if you're interested in learning more about these literatures, either from a research or from a practice perspective. So wanted to flag those. Final takeaway that I wanted to highlight from a substantive perspective is how much I appreciated the author's discussion, explicit acknowledgement and discussion around the really concerning role of stress and trauma, and that those experiences can play in the learning experience specifically. That wasn't very well articulated by me, but hopefully you all understand what I'm trying to get at. And the reason why I particularly appreciated this is that I think that I'm not sure about developmental literature, but certainly development as it relates to educational or as it's applied to educational psychology, I don't see enough explicit incorporation of the role and the power and the importance and the concerning consequences of stress and trauma for learning and development. So I wanted to kind of flag that as something that I thought was particularly valuable about this article. Almost finished, I promise. Related to writing, a few things that I want you to take away is that an article like this one is such a fantastic starting point to learn more. So let's say something caught your eye about something that might be particularly relevant to the development of your research interests, or there's a specific literature that they talked about in this article that particularly piqued your interest or excited you. This kind of a review article is such an excellent starting place. And what I recommend, how I recommend that you go from here with this kind of an article is to take a close look at that references list and to look up anything that seems to be kind of relevant to your interest or something that you want to pursue. And also to conduct what's referred to as a so-called forward search on an article like this. So if you go to a search engine or a search database rather, like Web of Science, if you conduct what's called a forward search, Web of Science or whatever database you use will actually present you with every single article that has cited Darling Hammond and colleagues, which can be a really, really helpful way to, again, if something within this article really interested you, looking at the references list, or in other words, doing a backward search and then seeing what articles have since cited this article, that's a really, really great starting point that can lead to the most positive kind of snowball effect in helping you identify literature that is particularly central to your research interests. So bottom line is, a review article like this is a very valuable resource as a starting point for allowing you to kind of pursue and learn more about the literature informing your research interests. Something else that I wanted to flag, this is really small but valuable in terms of a writing tool and skill, is I thought that this article provided particularly good examples of transition language, transition language to allow the readers to really kind of follow transitions from section to section. And I've just provided one example here in case you're interested at the bottom of, what was it? The bottom of page 105, where sentences like this, we turn to these important elements next. That transition language can be so valuable for, again, making sure that you don't lose the reader, particularly in such a long and dense, I don't mean that in a negative way, but long and dense article with so much information for the reader to keep track of. Finally, I'm going to conclude with one question that sort of has a couple of sub-questions subsumed within it that I want you to grapple with. Again, grappling with a question does not mean that I want you to come to class with any kind of a deep understanding of this question or fully thought out answers, but just something that I want to leave you with that we'll hopefully return to during our class discussion. So I want you to think about K-12 settings in general, or a more specific education context, including ones that are for students who are not within that K-12, or learners or other learning populations that are not within that K-12 context. So thinking about K-12 settings in general, or any more specific education context that particularly interests you, I want you to think about which, if any, of the systems and or principles really resonated with you and why. And I also want you to think about, do you think that the systems and or the principles that the authors promote are worthwhile? And also, do you think that they're realistic? So those questions are a lot. Again, I don't have answers to them, or certainly not fully fleshed out, well-articulated ones. And I don't expect that of any of you either. But this is something that I want you to grapple with and to think about. Because I think that a question like this and the kind of ideas that you have related to a question like this are going to be a fantastic jumping off point for us in our discussion next time we get together. So thank you all so much for listening. I'm going to end this recording now. Wonderful job making it through this article, especially so early in the semester. And I am really looking forward to our discussion about it. Thanks again for listening.